Welcome everyone. My name is David Pitt. It is great to have you all here this evening because we are in for a great night. For those still coming in, please come forward, fill in from the front and the sides, and if there's any room where you are, squish up a bit because we have a full house tonight. We might even need to open up these side seats and have people sitting sideways looking at you. So squeeze in as much as possible and we'll keep welcoming people down to the front. It won't be a great night if you don't know how to exit this building if there's a fire or some other emergency. And so to let you know how to do that, if we need to get out quickly, there are exits where you came in at the back, and there are also exits 2 at the front which you can get out quickly to safety. If you need the bathroom, you should head back to the foyer that you came in and grab a pass, or an usher will help you to get over to the building next door, and that is where they are. A big thank you to Ann Street Presbyterian Church for hosting us here this evening. Our topic for exploration is Christianity. Outdated? Bigoted? Untrue? ? And the event is brought to you by Third Space, which is an activity of City Bible Forum, and also by Undeceptions. Third Space exists to create opportunities to discern the truth and to seek meaning and purpose. Some of these opportunities occur by hearing from thoughtful speakers, as we will tonight. It's important to note that Third Space does not assume that everyone thinks the same or believes the same things. Attendees here tonight will have a diversity of views on the topics being discussed. We welcome the contest of ideas, and we consider this an important part of the search for genuine truth. Someone who has been helping people to discern the truth for a long time, and especially about Christianity, is John Gilson, and I'd like to welcome John to the stage.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, I'm John Gilson, and I host the Undeceptions podcast, and we're the other sponsor of this event. We are trying to let the truth out and create a space for people to ask their difficult questions. And a big part of tonight is precisely doing that. We're going to make sure we leave time for Q&A. We ran a very similar event on Monday night at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And when you're in an art gallery, it's easy to remember that some old things are still beautiful, important, and meaningful. And here we're running a very similar event, but in a church. And for many Australians, it doesn't have quite the same resonance. Many people are asking the question, yeah, Christianity is old, but is it meaningful? Is it beautiful? I mean, religion is as old as art, but at least in its Christian form, many people think it's not beautiful, it's outdated, bigoted, and just untrue. Now, we're going to hear from you during the Q&A, and you'll notice that the phone number will appear throughout the talk. Make sure you take that down, and you can just start texting your questions from now, and they'll eventually get to me, and I'll put them to our speakers. Our first speaker is Rachel Gilson. Rachel grew up thinking Christianity was outdated, bigoted, and untrue. So she's the perfect speaker. She somewhat changed her mind while at Yale University, where she graduated in history. She's the author of a terrific book I can't recommend highly enough, Born Again This Way. She then went on after Yale to complete a master's in theology, and she's currently working on a PhD in the topic of transgender identities. So even if you think Christianity is outdated, pretty sure you'll agree Rachel isn't. Please welcome Rachel Gilson.
Hey. I would be desperate to ask you for tips on how to enjoy Brisbane, but we're literally only here for like 5 minutes, it feels like. So I'll have to come back and see you again sometime. I'm excited to be with you here tonight, especially because I know some of you, like me, grew up not church-going at all. And I quite liked not growing up church-going. I thought of myself as free and independent. I liked that we weren't constricted as a family in the way that I saw many of my peers, always having to go into church. At the same time, when I got into high school, I really wanted to know, okay, so what do I actually think is true about the world? Something or other must be true. And so I did want to ask some of my peers who were churchgoers what they thought, they might have information about God that might be interesting to me. But as I interacted with my peers, I thought, I don't know. These answers seem kind of lame to me, kind of silly, kind of weak. I thought maybe this means that Christianity is just a crutch for people who don't know how to think for themselves. Maybe it's actually for people who are too lazy or not smart enough to make it through the world by themselves. I started doing some other reading and existentialism, things like that, and I was like, nah, okay. By the time I was at the end of high school, I was like, Christianity is clearly for idiots. The really mature actually understand what's true about the world, which is, that there's no God at all. The other thing that I was processing while I was in high school, besides theism at all, was my own sexuality. See, my female friends were, having crushes on boys, starting to date young men, and so I thought, I'll try this too. But I never really felt right. I never felt at home there. When I realized, wait a minute, I actually feel about other young women the way that my female friends feel about young men. And this was a little bit dangerous for me at the time. It was 2001. I was a 16-year-old. And it's a completely different world now than it was then. And I remember thinking, is this okay? Is this something I'm allowed to do? But again, I hadn't grown up with any belief system that gave me any morals at all. And I realized, it must be absolutely fine because, it's not hurting anybody. And even though at that point, as I started having romantic and sexual relationships with other young women, realizing I felt so at home there, at that point, same-sex marriage wasn't legal at all in the United States. But I knew that the future was with me, that these old beliefs and bigotries were going to die out and that I was going to get to move into a new, better space. So I grew up in Southern California. We were just in Sydney for a while. It really reminded me of where I grew up on the Central Coast. But I got tricked into moving to New England, which is in the northeast part of the United States, because I really wanted to go to Yale University, and all of their promotional information only showed the campus in like the 1 week of October where it's very beautiful. It's like golden light and lovely trees. And I thought, I'm going to be a scholar constantly with like this. Yeah, it was not like that at all. I moved without a winter coat and I regretted it almost immediately. But there were more things about Yale that were disturbing to me than just the weather. One of the things was that I had really built my identity on the fact that I was intellectually awesome, because I was an arrogant teenager. And instead, I showed up at this world-class university and realized everyone was smarter than me. It was devastating. Looked around, I thought, maybe I'm in the middle. No, I'm not even in the middle. I'm at the bottom. And so that part of my identity just crumbled into a little pile of ash. And the other thing that happened at that time was that the girl that I was dating, I was functionally obsessed with her, and she left me. If you've ever experienced a teenage breakup, you know that they hurt, they sting really badly. And this was particularly bad because she left me for this guy that lived in a van. And it wasn't even a van, like where you would stick the key in the ignition and it wouldn't start. You had to get it rolling down a hill first in order for the engine to engage. To ever be left for that person is just shameful. So I remember returning from winter break, back to Yale College, freezing cold, not smart, dumped terribly, and thinking, what am I going to do with myself? I was functionally going through an identity crisis or trying to figure out where I could possibly fit and not feeling like anything really stuck. But it was never for me like, oh, I should turn to Jesus on my own, because I didn't believe in Jesus. I thought he was a ridiculous cartoon character. Nonetheless, I happened to be in a course. It was the whole academic year, and so when we started back, it was a survey through Western philosophy. We were hearing about René Descartes. You may know him. He's the old, dead French guy who invented the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." And I remember the lecturer explaining to us in the audience that Descartes had moved from that phrase to a proof for the existence of God. And as I sat there listening to it, I thought, this is a really stupid proof for the existence of God. I haven't looked at it recently. I don't know what I'd think of it. But I hadn't heard it before. And I was really sort of jolted by the fact that I hadn't heard it and couldn't crush it, because I'd kind of prided myself on knowing various little proofs and being able to pop them down. In fact, I had a high school teacher who was an atheist who affectionately nicknamed me Satan, because I just used to pick on the Christian kids to make them cry. So I was a little bit troubled. I was a little bit curious. And so whenever you have an important and vulnerable question, you should ask the internet, right? That's what I did. This was 2004, so my internet laptop was like that thick, right? So you needed all your strength to get it propped up into position. And I would just type in random religious search terms, because I wanted to figure out, what is there to this? What do I need to put in there? And I would start in all kinds of different places, but again and again, I would end up reading about Jesus. You know, when you follow hyperlinks for hours, you're like, how did I get here? I just kept coming back to him. And I was interested in Jesus now as a character. Again, 2004 in America, I had sort of thought of Jesus as like an ancient George W. Bush wrapped in a toga or something, like not a good image. But instead, I was encountering a character who was really tender, who was clearly really intelligent. I was interested in Jesus as a literary figure. But I also felt sort of disturbed by that interest that I had, not only because I considered myself a good card-carrying atheist, but even especially because of my sexuality. I thought, I want to marry a woman someday. Like, I can't be interested in this guy. But the only two people I knew at Yale who identified as Christians were these two young women who were dating each other. And one of them was training to be a Lutheran minister, which to my ears sounded like top-tier type of Christian, you know what I mean? Like, really serious. So I went to them thinking, well, they'll be able to explain to me maybe how these things aren't as in opposition as I think. And they were really sweet, generous, gave me their time. And they were like, yeah, this has all been a big misunderstanding. The Bible actually affirms monogamous gay relationships. And I was really startled by that. And they were like, yeah, okay, so we have a packet of information explaining the correct way to interpret the Bible. It's been hidden and misinterpreted, but here's the correct way to do it. And I was really excited to receive this because I love a packet. I'm very nerdy. So I remember taking it back to my room and ripping through it and I was like, oh, this is so good. Like, the information was compelling. It had internal consistency. I really enjoyed it. But I also thought, okay, I'm training to be a history major. I should look at the original documents. So I pulled out my stack of ancient papyri, and no, I didn't have that. I just had the internet again, right? It's Google all the way down. But I would pull up because I didn't own a Bible either, so I would just pull up online the scriptures it was claiming to talk about and compare the packet to those scriptures. And I realized fairly quickly, oh, this seemed really good, but I don't think that that's at all what these texts are actually saying. Like, I'm not a Bible scholar, but one of the only things I'm good at is reading, and I just don't think this works. And I felt so frustrated. I felt stupid for having put any stock in it at all, and I remember just throwing it in my dorm room trash can, which was so cheap it just fell over with the force. A little while after that, even though I'd said I won't think about this again at all, I happened to be in the room of a friendly acquaintance of mine. We weren't particularly close, but I was in her room this day because we were going to walk together somewhere maybe. I remember she was in her room getting something out of her bag. If you've ever seen Gilmore Girls, The Yale dorm rooms really do look like that, so you can picture it a little bit. And she had a bookshelf next to her doorway, and one of my favorite hobbies is to look at people's bookshelves and judge them. So it's a great thing to do at a place like Yale. I was looking through, and she had this volume titled Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And I hadn't read Narnia as a kid, so the name wasn't particularly meaningful to me, but the title was really interesting. I thought, of course I should be reading a book and not just the internet. But I was too embarrassed to ask my friend for the book because I didn't want anyone to notice that I was interested in this topic even a little bit. So I just stole the book because it's very small and it fits in your bag, and I had literally no moral compass. So I can't believe you're laughing at that. No, I'm just kidding. A little while after that, maybe a few days or whatever, I was in one of Yale's libraries. There was too much time before going to my next class, and I couldn't go all the way back, So I was reading the book instead of doing my homework. And I'd been reading some other stuff online too, but it was during reading this book one day that I was suddenly overwhelmed with understanding, oh, God does exist. Not like the Force in Star Wars or an ancient god like Zeus, one of many, but the God who made everything, the God who made me, a God who was perfect. And this was a very disturbing thing for me to rush all upon me at once. I felt fear because I'd met me. I was arrogant, I was unkind, I was a liar, I was sexually immoral, I was reading a stolen book. It was like pretty clear next to perfection that all of my chips were going into the guilty category. Really quickly with that fear, I also understood that part of the reason Jesus had come was to place himself as a barrier between God's wrath and me. Is that the only way to be safe was to run towards Jesus, not away from Jesus. And if I'm honest, the very first thing I thought was, I don't want to become a Christian. Christians are very lame. But I was also like, well, I can't pretend that this isn't true just because it's inconvenient for my reputation or my lifestyle. Like, that's pretty stupid. I should take this deal. It's a good deal. So I didn't have a pastor with me or a campus minister or anything like this. I kind of knew I needed to pray, and so I scrunched up my eyes, and I was like, okay, fine, I'll be a Christian. And then I went to class. Like, I had no idea what I was supposed to do with myself. On my way to class, outside one of the dining halls, I saw a little advertisement for a Christian group at Yale. They were going to have a party 2 days later. I showed up at the party pretending I was there by accident because I still didn't know what to do with myself. But instead, I just started following them around like a little baby quail. All the things they did. I hugged when they hugged. I saw that people lifted their hands while singing, which I thought was weird. And I learned we prayed and we read the Bible, and we did not curse, and we did not drink too much. A little bumps, but I really loved being a part of that new community, getting to know this new faith of mine. But it was clear to me really early that my attraction to other women hadn't gone anywhere. And it's been 19 and a half years, and my attraction to other women hasn't gone anywhere. So a huge part of my early discipleship, my early following of Jesus, was this question of why? Because I had seen in scriptures that God said no to same-sex lust and sexual relationships. And I've since learned Greek and Hebrew, and it still says no. So that's not the part I've ever struggled with. I think the Bible's actually incredibly clear. But I really wasn't clear on why. Way before the phrase love is love was sort of a slogan, that was my understanding. This doesn't hurt anyone. So I would kind of bargain with God, like, if you'll just tell me why you say this, and I will obey you perfectly, which is silly, but when we bargain with God, sometimes we're a little silly. And I remember the Lord sort of pressing back on me, like, if you're only willing to obey when you understand and agree, maybe you're not worshiping me as God. Maybe you're worshiping yourself as God. It was this process where I realized I needed to learn actually how to, in this case, obey before I understood, which was terrifying. And I wasn't sure exactly what to do. I thought a lot in that time about the story at the beginning of the Bible, the story in the garden where God set the man and the woman in this beautiful place. Everything is good and good and good and good, and they are very good. And he gives them a beautiful vision to be fruitful and go and make the whole world fruitful. I mean, it's a glorious vision. Any God who would give humanity that must be good. And yet there's this interesting prohibition that he also speaks about in the garden. And the thing about the prohibition that interested me, especially early on, was that it wasn't necessarily very intuitive. We could imagine, for example, if God had said to Adam and Eve, hey guys, here's your first rule. Don't murder each other. Because we intuitively understand that murder is wrong. If you don't understand that murder is wrong intuitively, you should talk to somebody about that. And we could even come up with good reasons why, so if you kill one of them off, you can't be fruitful and multiply. It's taking the life of an image bearer would be like, yes, very good rule, God, yes. But instead, he says, you can eat of any tree in the garden, but you shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The day you eat it, you're going to die. But even vegans eat fruit. You know what I mean? It's a weird prohibition on the front end of it. And this was exactly where the serpent pressed on Eve. He got her to use her own data to consider it. She saw, this fruit is attractive to look at. It's going to be delicious to eat. It's going to have the advantage of making me wise. That's some really good things about this. And the only thing she had on the other side was God's word saying, if you do this, you're going to die. And I felt like I was in the same position. Like I had all these reasons why I should say yes to my same-sex attraction. Like really good reasons, I thought. And the only thing I had on the other side, it felt like, was God's word saying, if you do this, you're going to die. How was I possibly going to make a different decision than even Adam had made in the garden? Because really they thought, God is withholding something from us. And they ate, and we were plunged into sin. And that was the moment that drove me further into the character of Christ. You might remember when I was sharing, really, I said yes to Christ because I was afraid and I saw a rock to hide under. But it was this movement in my discipleship where I realized, wait a minute. He's not just good in some sort of ontological sense or because of what he did. He's actually for me. He's good for me. And it's not even just that he was willing to die for me, although that would have been enough. I can't think of anyone I would die for, let alone like my sworn enemy. But it was even the fact that he decided to come and take on human flesh at all. No one forced his hand. He didn't owe me anything. I would have died in my sin, seen myself in comparison to his perfection, said, yeah, you have to condemn me. But he decided to come, to be sent by the Father, and live a very difficult life, poor in an oppressed country, a backwater really. And when he grows up, he's homeless. If you read the New Testament, all of his friends are idiots. And the people who are studying to know him the most end up going on a successful murder campaign. None of that did I deserve. None of that do you deserve. And yet Christ gave it willingly. And it grounded me in a new way in, I know sometimes his words may feel arbitrary or cruel here, but I know his character is not arbitrary or cruel. And it was the only way to ground a very risky and vulnerable obedience for me at that point. Now, in different versions, when I get to share what God has done in my life, I do get to share that I didn't stay at that point with not understanding why. Tonight, Rebecca's actually going to pick up some of that content, so you'll get to hear later some of God's positive vision for sexuality. But I think if you took nothing else from my point tonight, I would want you to hear that Jesus is true and good and worthy. And if you do not follow him, you should pursue him. Take him seriously. He is so much more than you could possibly imagine. And if you do already follow him tonight, some of you probably experience same-sex attraction, others of you don't. But each of us in our following him are going to be faced with words he says that are risky and vulnerable, that feel scary to follow. And I would just encourage you, press into him. Know for yourselves that he is good, and he will lead you into places that you could have never imagined. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm sure that's provoking questions. I look forward to seeing them and throwing them at Rachel and Rebecca. We're mixing the accents tonight. I suppose I speak with the colonial convict accent we're all so proud of. You've heard the revolutionary accent just then, and now you're about to hear the Queen's English. Rebecca is an Englishwoman who lives now in the US, but she completed her doctorate at Cambridge University in the topic of prisons in England and Shakespeare. She now lives in the other Cambridge, that's Massachusetts in the US, where she lives a very busy life as a mum, a wife, an in-demand speaker, and a writer of about a book a year, it seems, including the incredibly influential Confronting Christianity. Also a secular creed, and a new one, Jesus Through the Eyes of Women. And she's about to publish another one on the topic of friendship. She is unstoppable. Please welcome Rebecca McLaughlin.
Thanks, John. As John mentioned, I come from the UK, and my main goal as a Brit in Australia is to stay in my crease. So here it is. Here it is. I'm ready. I gotta warn you, that's my only joke tonight. Rachel's much funnier than I am, so you're just gonna get the relentless earnestness from me and all the laughs from her. So, consider yourselves lucky you got to hear her, and prepare yourself for my thoughts. But because I'm from the UK, not only do I have to make cricket references, but I also have to talk about J.K. Rowling, because I'm a big fan of Harry Potter. Raise your hand if you have read the books or seen the films. Okay. If you haven't, I need you to block your ears or put your noise-cancelling headphones in for about the next minute, because I'm going to drop the most horrific spoiler, and I would hate to ruin it for you. But if you have read the books or seen the films, you'll know that in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, J.K. Rowling basically sticks a knife in all of our hearts. Professor Dumbledore is the Gandalf of the series. He's the only man whose power for good can match Lord Voldemort's evil. But in the sixth book, a weakened Dumbledore stands at the top of the astronomy tower, surrounded by his enemies, and he appeals to Harry's teacher nemesis, Severus Snape, for help. Severus, please. And Snape kills him. The scene is devastating. We never liked Professor Snape, but we hope beyond hope that he was Dumbledore's man, and now his betrayal of his mentor is complete. It's only in the last book that we realize how wrong we were. When Harry dives into the Pensieve, that magical bowl where you can dive into somebody else's past, and there we discover that everything Snape has done has been driven by his passionate, hopeless, unrequited love for Harry's mother. We see Snape's anguish when Lily Potter is murdered by Voldemort, and how he then commits himself to Dumbledore. We hear Dumbledore telling Snape that he is dying from the slow workings of an irreversible curse, and making Snape promise to kill him when the moment comes. And suddenly the meaning of Severus, please, is reversed. If you are not a Christian here tonight, my guess is that as you look over at the Christian faith, you probably see a number of things that look like Snape killing Dumbledore. Perhaps you see a white-centered religion with a history of racism and scriptures that condone slavery. Maybe you see an anti-intellectual mindset and a contradictory Bible that's been disproved by science again and again. Perhaps you see homophobia, the denigration of women, and a refusal to acknowledge that love is love. But just as when Harry dived into Snape's memories, his perception of what Snape had done completely reversed, so I think that when we look more closely at each of these seemingly devastating roadblocks to faith in Jesus, they actually become signposts. I won't be able to cover each and all of those topics tonight, but I'd like to actually work through the 3 words that we have up on the screen here now. I'd like to ask ourselves, is it true? Is Christianity outdated? Is it bigoted? And is it untrue? And as we look more closely at each of those challenges to the Christian faith, I think we'll find something that we weren't expecting. So number 1, is Christianity outdated? And my guess is most of us have grown up in one part or other of the Western world. I know Australia is sort of geographically in a curious place, but in some senses, very much part of the Western world. I grew up in the UK, Rachel in the US, many of you, I'm guessing, in one part of Australia or another. And my guess is that for many of us, our experience, whether we identify as Christians ourselves or not, is that Christianity is in decline. You know, perhaps our parents' generation, perhaps our grandparents' generation, our great-grandparents' generation worshipped in churches that maybe looked something like this. But for us, or for our children, or for our grandchildren, it's pretty clear that Christianity is just becoming less and less relevant. It's simply outdated, and probably if we wait around long enough, if each of us lives long enough, we'll see it decline even more. It turns out that's actually a very parochial view of the world. But if that's how you feel, you're not alone. 40 years ago, it's pretty much what every sociologist of religion worth their salt thought. You know, they thought that as the world in general became more modern, more scientific, more educated, that religious belief would naturally decline. It had happened in Western Europe, where I'm from, and where Western Europe leads, the rest of the world must follow, right? Wrong. Not only has religion in general and Christianity in particular failed to decline over the last 40 years, but actually now as sociologists look out over the next 40 years to 2060, they're anticipating an increasingly religious world. So right now, Christianity is by far the largest global belief system, with about 31% of the world identifying as Christian. Rather than decreasing, that proportion is actually set to increase slightly by 2060 to about 32%. The second largest belief system in the world is Islam. And the proportion of Muslims in the world is set to increase quite substantially from about 25-26% now to 31% by 2060, making it a very close competitor with Christianity. Hinduism and Buddhism, next 2 largest global religions, are set to decrease slightly in that period. But here's the real shock for those of us living in the West. The proportion of people who do not identify with any particular religion, so that includes people who identify as atheist, agnostic, or just nothing in particular, that proportion is set to decrease from about 16% to 13%. The tide isn't going out on religion, it's actually coming in. What's even more surprising, to many at least of my friends who are not Christians, is that Christianity is by far the most diverse belief system in the world. Whether you look at race or geography or socioeconomics or ethnicity or culture, Christianity is actually the only sort of truly global belief system. So rather than being outdated, actually as we look out to the future to our children or grandchildren, if we have them or anticipate having them, they're going to be living in a world that is increasingly religious. Now, part of this story is the story of what's happening in China. Now, right now, China is the global center of atheism, but the church in China has been growing so fast that experts think there'll be more Christians in China than in America extremely soon. and that China could actually be a majority Christian country by 2060. There's one leading sociologist of religion in China called Feng Yang who thinks that. Likewise, at that time, about 40% of the world's Christians are likely to be living in sub-Saharan Africa. So rather than being outdated, Christianity seems to be the belief system that is making sense to people all across the world and isn't just tied to one particular culture, as people tend to think. Now, if you're someone who's ever spent time reading the Bible, actually this makes a lot of sense. Because if you open the New Testament, you read about Jesus of Nazareth, as Rachel's been mentioning, you'll find a man who, among other things, broke through every racial and cultural barrier of his day and commanded his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. We see from the very first that the Christian church was a multi-ethnic and multiracial movement. We see the first African Christian we know of, we hear his story in the book of Acts in the New Testament. We see actually from the very first that Christianity spread to a wide diversity of different cultural contexts. So it shouldn't surprise us that today, Christianity remains by far the most diverse belief system. You might say, well, okay, perhaps a lot of people believe in Christianity, but we can still say that it's outdated. You know, things that are outdated are things that once upon a time worked well, but actually just don't really work in the modern world. So perhaps these people are all just very deluded. But here's a really interesting statistic, and one I'm pretty sure you will appreciate as Australians, whether or not, however you identify religiously. It turns out that in the United States of America, people who go to church, about 36% of them say that they are very happy, whereas only 25% of Americans who don't participate in any religious services say they're very happy. So there's a meaningful happiness sort of differential between people who go to church and people who don't. In Australia, 45% of people who go to church say they're very happy, and 33% of people who don't go to church say they're very happy. So if you want to be really happy, be both Australian and church-going. But if you can only be one or the other, you know, sort of a little bit of a differential there. And actually, this isn't just a sort of random outlier statistic. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a short walk from MIT and from Harvard University. And there's a professor at Harvard University called Tyler Vanderveel, if you want to Google him. Rachel's told us how great it is to Google things, and she's not wrong. His whole research team at Harvard looks at the mental and physical health benefits of going to church every week. And the effects are actually quite dramatic. I'll give you a sampling of them in just a second. But a little disclaimer, these effects are not unique to going to church versus going to a synagogue, for instance, if you were from a Jewish tradition. But they do seem to be unique to religious participation. So you couldn't just kind of go to the golf club or play cricket once a week with the same group of people to have the same kind of effect. And it turns out, for instance, that people who go to church every week when they're 20 live 7 years longer than people who don't. The impact on people's physical health is dramatic to the extent that if you look at people in the next 16 years, those who go to church every week live 20 to 30% less likely to die in the next 16 years than people who never go to church. And if you look at things like depression, and if you look at things like suicidal ideation, you find that actually being regularly part of a religious community is exceedingly good for us humans. And curiously, it seems that it's especially good for women. I don't know why this is, but the impact on women seems to be even more dramatic than the impact on men. Now, for instance, women who go to church every week are 5 times less likely to kill themselves than women who never go to church. And these very clever scholars do kind of correct for all sorts of things that might confound these results. They're sort of careful to compare like with like. There seems to be, just from a psychological perspective and from a sort of physical health perspective, it's actually really good for you to be actively religious. In fact, Tyler Vanderveel and his merry men at Harvard, men and women, it's not just men, but, you know, merry men is the line, they found that going to church every week is about as good for you as eating more fruits and vegetables, or even nearly as good as quitting smoking. So if you really like smoking, then at least go to church, sort of make up for it. So again, if we kind of leave aside the question of whether Christianity is true or not, actually, to say that Christianity is outdated doesn't really work. Number one, because the world is becoming more Christian and not less. And number two, because Christianity seems to really work in terms of the things that we all care about, our mental health, our happiness, our physical health. So what about this second claim that Christianity is bigoted? We've heard Rachel speaking at length on this, so I won't spend wildly long. But the reality is, sort of going back to the Harry Potter situation, when Snape killed Dumbledore, really all doubt in the reader's minds as to whether he was on the side of good or evil died as well, right? And when I stand for Christian sexual ethics, so including the fact that from a Christian perspective, sex only belongs in marriage between one man and one woman for life, when I stand for that in Brisbane, Australia, or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, or in London, England, where I'm from, I move over in most people's minds from delusion to bigotry. It's not just, poor thing, she's not smart enough to realize that Christianity isn't true. It's actually, no, her beliefs are harmful to others, right? And the reality is, there have been many times in the last decades and the last centuries when people who identify as Christians have truly been hateful and bigoted in their attitudes toward people who would identify as gay or lesbian. So is that the necessary conclusion of believing the Bible and what the Bible says about sexuality? I actually don't think that it is. You see, just as when Harry dived into that Pensieve, he discovered that Snape's story was not a story of hate, but a story of love, I think that when we dive into what the Bible has to say about sexuality, we find that it's a love story too, but it's just a much bigger and more extraordinary love story than we were ready for. So the love story begins in the Old Testament as prophet after prophet compares God to a loving, faithful husband and Israel, God's people, to his often unfaithful wife. But his marriage is in crisis. God's people are cheating on him again and again and again. It seems like it only can be headed for divorce. And then Jesus steps onto the stage of human history, and he makes all sorts of strange claims about himself, and one of those strange claims is that he is the bridegroom. And why would he say that? This is a man who never married in his entire life on earth. So what is Jesus talking about to say he is the bridegroom? Well, actually, it's one of the ways in which he's stepping into the shoes of the creator God of the Old Testament. We see this love story, sort of another rendition of it in Paul, one of the first Christian leaders, his letter to the Ephesians, where he describes Christian marriage as being like a little scale model of Jesus' love for his people. And the song rises to a full-blown crescendo at the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, when a great shout goes out, the wedding of the Lamb has come, and Jesus' marriage to his church brings heaven and earth back together. This, from a Christian perspective, is why marriage is male-female, and why husbands and wives are called to different roles. Like Christ and the church, it's a love across difference. Like Christ and the church, it's a love built on sacrifice. Like Christ and the church, it's a flesh-uniting, life-creating, never-ending, exclusive love. So marriage is meant to point us to Christ. But it's also meant to disappoint us. Because even the absolute best human marriage could only ever be a tiny echo of Jesus' love for us. Many of my friends who are not Christians think that Christian sexual ethics is really weird. And I sometimes say, it's actually a lot weirder than you think. Because it's not primarily about a man and a woman making each other very happy. It's not even primarily, if we look at what the scriptural passage on this, about two people having children. That's a wonderful thing, an important part of God's design. It's actually, first and foremost, a little signpost, a little dramatic working out of Jesus' love for his people. and the kind of intimacy that the Lord desires to have with us extraordinarily. Now, so where does that leave us? Where does that leave somebody like me, who is a Christian and who believes this sort of very curious thing about sexual ethics? Well, it has two big implications in my life. The first implication is sort of a personal one. So like Rachel, I have always been attracted to other women. Unlike Rachel, I've actually been a Christian for as long as I can remember. So for me, rather than sort of coming into faith in Jesus, knowing this about myself, having those kinds of experiences behind me, I've actually sort of grown up as a Christian, knowing what the Bible taught, and knowing what my heart wanted. And I remember, as a teenager, some in this room, similar kind of age, I remember thinking, this is something I'll grow out of, right? I was actually in an all-girls school, so I thought maybe I just haven't met enough guys. I thought when I go to university, I'll definitely start being interested in men. So I went to university, no, not at all interested in men still. I kept telling myself, I'm going to grow out of this. And then I got to grad school, and I still haven't grown out of it. And I thought, once you're in your mid-20s, you can't really tell yourself you're just going to grow out of stuff anymore. I sort of have to reckon with this reality in my life. And this reality of something that seems to sort of spring up relatively naturally within me. How am I going to hold that together with what the Bible says? Now, like Rachel, the conclusion that I've come to there is that actually, if Jesus is who he claims to be, then pursuing and receiving his love is actually worth giving up anything else for. In fact, Jesus made it very clear. He was in some ways a sort of terrible marketing manager for his own movement. He said, anyone who wants to come after me must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. But then he said this very curious thing. Anyone who wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. If Jesus is who he says he is, he's making some very big promises. And any follower of Jesus who commits themselves to him and makes life decisions on the basis of following him is counting on those being true. But if Jesus really is, as he claims, the way, the truth, and the life, then no one who has sacrificed their own romantic or sexual fulfillment to follow Jesus will feel like they've lost out in the end. In fact, all of us who follow Jesus will be part of that great marriage at the end of time, to which human marriage is its very best point. But there's another implication of believing what I do, believing that the Bible, even when it says very unpopular, controversial, and even today's is offensive things, is actually true. And that is that I need to follow the Bible's consistent call to love my neighbor. Now this call was given multiple times in the scriptures, and it was particularly explained by Jesus by a story about a Samaritan who was a member of the hated racial and religious group from the perspective of Jesus' fellow Jews at the time, showing love to a Jewish man. So it's sort of love in a very improbable, unexpected way. And actually, Christians are called not to just love people who are like them, not to just love fellow Christians, not to just love people who might have the same sexual ethics as they do, but actually to love even their enemies. Christians are called to love even folks who would want to persecute them. So any time that you have witnessed or experienced Christians acting hatefully towards somebody who identifies as gay or lesbian, they're actually specifically going against what Jesus calls them to. So is Christianity bigoted? I actually don't think so. I think following Jesus means showing radical love to everyone you encounter, however that is or isn't received by them. So what about this third point? And as I say, everything kind of stands or falls on this. Is Christianity true? I see I have 7 minutes and 30 seconds left, so I'm not going to be able to kind of cover everything. But I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I think are some of the big reasons people would have, aside from those kind of moral reasons around sexual ethics, and aside from that sense of like, well, Christianity is just like old hat. Two of the big reasons that people have for thinking, you know what, Christianity is just not like intellectually credible. You know, I am a modern, educated, 21st century, scientifically literate person, can't possibly believe in the crazy claims of the Christian faith. One is science, and the other is scripture. So I'm going to start with science. I went a few years ago, well, this story is actually going to impact both science and scripture. A few years ago, I went to an event at Harvard down the street from me with an old friend of mine from grad school in the UK, who is a professor at Harvard in the sciences. And he himself, he's sort of culturally Jewish, but convictionally atheist. And the title of this event was The Bible, Gospel, Guide, or Garbage. And after the event, I said to my friend, I know that you think that what I believe is crazy. And his then girlfriend, who was a much gentler soul than either of us, said, oh, I'm sure he doesn't think that. I said, yes, he does. Yeah, I believe the whole of human history revolves around a first century Jewish man who died on a cross and was supposedly raised to life 3 days later. Crazy, right? My friend said yes. I said, the problem is, I think you actually believe some crazy things as well. I think it's very easy in our modern culture for people to think that there is a perfectly coherent sort of secular belief system that does all the work that Christianity does, but without you having to believe in crazy things like people rising from the dead. But the reality is, there actually is no such belief system. Now, one of the big areas, as I say, that I think people imagine that Christianity has just been disproved is in that area that my friend is an expert in, is in the area of science. Now, in many people's minds, the whole project of science has been to give us an alternative hypothesis to belief in God, right? You know, once upon a time, in a pre-scientific age, it was easy for people to believe that there was a God who created the universe and everything in it, and human beings. But now, you know, we've just figured stuff out. We've worked out the scientific processes by which all sorts of things happened. And so we can no longer believe that there is a creator God. But here's the thing. Science actually, originally, what we now call science, was developed by Christians, not as an alternative to the hypothesis that there is a creator God, but actually because they believe in a creator God who is both rational and free. Now, don't take my word for this. There's a professor at Princeton called Hans Halvorson, who's one of the top 4 philosophers of science in the world. And he says not only is it the case that originally science was sort of philosophically based on belief in a creator God, but that actually even today, Christianity gives you a much firmer sort of philosophical basis for science than atheism does. He says atheism doesn't actually give you a philosophical basis for science at all. Now, at best, if you're an atheist, and to be clear, there are many world-class scientists who are atheists, but when you sort of drill down to, you know, why does this work? The best thing you can say is, well, aren't we lucky that it does? It's a sort of whole realm of science, and you're probably familiar with all the kind of controversies in the history of science and Christianity, where it seemed like there's sort of science on one side and Christians on the other side, and the scientists always win over the Christians. You know, these stories are told especially by folks like Richard Dawkins, my fellow countrymen, the sort of new atheist lads, who like to tell these stories of the continual advance of science and the continual decline of Christianity. But actually, interestingly, if you look back at any and all of these controversies, you'll find there are Christians on both sides of the table. Now, don't get me wrong, Christians have been debating how science and scripture relate to each other since at least the 4th century. So I'm not saying there are kind of easy, simplistic answers to everything, but I'm saying actually, science was, from the first, a Christian project. And even today, Christianity has some rich resources for helping us to think about the created world. So what about scripture? Going back to the title of that event I took my friend to, the Bible, Gospel, Guide, or Garbage. Now, what about these 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' life, the so-called Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Weren't they written just way after the events that they claim to describe? How could we possibly think that they're giving us real access to the life and teachings of this first century Jewish rabbi known as Jesus of Nazareth? experts think that the earliest gospel to be written down most likely was Mark's gospel, and that it was written between 35 and 45 years after the events that it records. The latest to be written down was very likely John's gospel, probably maybe 60 years after the events that it records. Now, depending on how old you are in this room, that will either sound like ridiculously long ago, or it will sound actually kind of recent, right? If there's anybody in this room who is over 50, if I were to ask you about things that happened 35 years ago, and you were to tell me, and then I was to say, oh, you couldn't possibly remember, you'd probably slap me across the face and tell me not to be a cheeky little something or other, right? Because we don't remember everything that happened decades ago, but we actually do remember the things that really made a difference to us. Now, meeting Jesus was a life-changing experience. And the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written down to preserve the eyewitness testimony of men and women, and actually often of women, who met with Jesus, who saw what he did, who heard what he taught. They're not just stories written about something that happened long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. They're eyewitness testimony about this extraordinary man who, by any measure, whether you believe he is the Son of God or not, is the most influential human being in history. And yet he never wrote a book, or sat on a throne, or led an army. All he had was his crazy claims about himself, and the most crazy claim of all, that he was raised from the dead. Now, I can't convince you tonight that Jesus' resurrection actually happened. But I hope I can encourage you, if you're not a Christian, to look seriously at the evidence for it. I know a woman back in the US who's a history professor who became a Christian last year because she came to the conclusion that actually, yes, the resurrection of Jesus happened. So it's not just evidence that you can completely dismiss out of hand. It's actually evidence that's very much worth looking at. So is Christianity outdated, bigoted, untrue? Is Jesus just a relic of the ancient world? I don't think so. Instead, I believe that he is our modern world's best hope.
Well, we're just going to get the comfy seats out and take your questions. A few have come in already. Thanks, Kaylee. I'm sorry to do that to you. So keep sending them in to that text number. Thanks, Dave. And in 29 minutes, we'll try get through as many of your questions as possible. We'll start with the really deep and important ones. Rebecca, favourite Harry Potter book or movie?
Oh gosh, that is so hard. I'll tell you my favourite scene. Can I do that instead?
Yeah, sure.
So Molly Weasley, throughout the series, is this like lovely, what we would call in America, stay-at-home mum, right? You know, she's a wonderful sort of homemaker, and everybody wants to have Molly as their mum, right? She's just lovely. And then the most powerful witch in the world goes after her daughter, and suddenly she becomes utterly terrifying and she kills her. And I won't quote exactly what she says because it's inappropriate to say in a church setting. But she says, not my daughter, you, and then she doesn't say which, but she says something else. And I just, oh my goodness, I'm melted in that. And also at the very end, when Harry's called his son Albus Severus, I read that to my kids and I just wept. Carry on.
You should get her talking about Shakespeare. It starts dripping out of her. Hey, how has your same-sex attraction changed? If indeed it has. We're going to go for both of you.
All right.
My experience of same-sex attraction, I'm still if I'm attracted to anyone who's not my spouse, it's a woman. But the experience is different now that I have been walking with Christ for so long. Because when I was a teenager, before I knew him, I really believed what the world told me, which is that the only way to be your free and authentic self was to pursue everything you feel. And so I thought, oh, I'm feeling something. I need to run right after it. But in Christ, I've discovered, oh, actually, the only people who only do what they feel are toddlers. It doesn't always lead to goodness in your life. And so now when I experience attraction to another woman, I've been able to understand, well, that's not what I'm called to. I can say no to that with freedom and rest and say yes to Christ.
Yeah, so I'll add to that. I mean, fun fact, Rachel and I are both married to men, and we've been married almost exactly the same length of time, funnily enough. Two delightful men called Brian and Andrew. Well, one's called Brian, the other was called Andrew. It'd be weird if they were both called Brian and Andrew. Be creepy. And people often ask, well, like, how can that be? You know, you say you're attracted to women, and yet you married a man. Like, were you trying to fix yourself? No. I don't think there's any if you're a Christian here today, I'm willing to bet that you, on occasion, are attracted to somebody you're not married to. I'm willing to bet that's true whether or not you're married, and whatever, reasonable age you are. So I didn't expect when I married Brian for my sort of attractions to suddenly change. And like Rachel, any time I've been attracted to somebody outside my marriage in the last sort of 16 years, it's always been to a woman. But I think, like Rachel, something has changed about how I have received that sort of incoming information. I've sometimes joked, Rachel and I should do a road show called Angst and Experience, because I have all the angst and she has all the experience. So one of the things that's changed for me is that as I've lent more into what the Bible says, I've discovered not only this extraordinary love story that human romantic feelings even are meant to sort of point us to, but also that time and again, if you look from the very beginning of the Bible, when God says no to something, it's not because he's trying to deprive us of something really good. Often there is actually, if we're told that something is wrong or sinful, it's kind of adjacent to something that is actually really good, and that God in fact calls us into. And I think part of what's happened in our culture is that we have collapsed every kind of intimacy into sexual and romantic intimacy. And we have lost a vision for deep, meaningful friendship love, which in fact, if you open the Bible and read through the New Testament, you will find is all over the place. So the sort of common mantra, like love is love, which says, the love between two men and two women could be just as faithful, meaningful, enduring as the love between a man and a woman. From a Christian perspective, I'd actually want to say not only no, but also yes. Like, I think the Bible, as Rachel's mentioned, I think it's quite clear in its no to same-sex sexual relationships for Christians. But it's not because it says no to love relationships between people of the same sex. It's just that those relationships are pointing us to a different angle on God's love for us. And rather than being exclusive, as Christian marriage is meant to be, actually friendship is meant to be sort of inclusive. And we get, again, a different sort of angle on Jesus' love for us. I spoke much too much. I'll be quicker on the next question, I promise.
Regarding marriage and having children, are we meant to have as many babies as possible? The Bible says multiply and cover the earth. How far do we take that? Is having one child worse than having 8?
I only have one child, so if the answer to this is yes, I'm in big trouble.
I have 3, just saying.
Nitpicky. It does not say be multiply and cover the earth. That's not in there. So the interesting thing, there's a move, if you want a little theology moment, there's a move between the Old Testament and the New Testament on what the importance of childbearing is. I don't think we should take the time to do that exactly right now, but just know that. Fruitfulness is a beautiful picture of the gospel set within marriage, but also in the New Testament, Jesus says, go into the world and make disciples of all nations, which is sort of a transposition, a reframing of that original be fruitful and multiply. So now as Christians, the most important reproduction we can participate in, actually, is declaring to people that there is a God who created them and redeemed them and desperately wants them to be his children.
Can Rebecca repeat the name of the sociologist whom you referenced, who's studying the effects of regular church-going?
Tyler Vanderbilt.
Oh, well done. She listens to me. Tyler Vanderweel. It's I think pronounced Vanderbilt, but it's V-A-N-D-E-R. I'm terrible at spelling. W-E-E-E. No, W-E-E-L-E. I'm so bad at spelling, but I'm pretty sure that's right. He's a great guy.
Yep. Do you think Christianity and colonialism go hand in hand?
Do you want to do this? Or should I as the Brit? Should I as like... So, no. The quickest answer is no. As I mentioned, Christianity has from the first been a multicultural movement. And it has been a missionary movement. So as Rachel just mentioned, at the end of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says to his disciples, go and make disciples of all nations. And he says that to a bunch of Jews, actually, but it's clear from the very earliest scriptures that we have, the birthday of the church, in fact, the day of Pentecost, is sort of big outpouring of God's Spirit on people from all sorts of different places. So it is absolutely appropriate from a Christian perspective that people should travel to share the good news of Jesus with people all over the world. It is absolutely inappropriate for Christians to say, oh, do you know what? These people already had their own religious tradition, and so I should not bring them the message of Jesus. It is also completely inappropriate for a Christian to say, along with the message of Jesus, I'm going to package my own culture, whatever that is. I mean, the big question, one of the big questions in the early church was, did people have to become Jewish in order to become Christian? You know, did people have to be circumcised, for instance, and start following the Jewish law? And the emphatic answer was no. And I think, we could sort of transpose that into the colonial era. And say, there were times when people, especially from my country, but sometimes from hers as well, acted like in order to become a Christian, you have to become functionally British or to become functionally American. That's total rubbish. And there's been a lot of sinful behavior that's gone down in sort of colonial movements.
Yeah. Related to this, do Christianity and politics go together? When Christianity gets involved in politics, it seems to discriminate against people.
I was reading today interpretations of the Gospel of Luke and his book of Acts, and some scholars who are like, Luke is clearly trying to persuade people that Christianity is not troublesome to the Roman Empire. Christians are good citizens, they're not going to disturb anything. Every time thing goes wrong, it's actually not Christians. Then there are other scholars of Luke who are like, no, that's not true, because whenever you're saying Jesus is Lord, it is absolutely political. And so the author I was reading was saying, well, isn't it in fact both? And that there's something really interesting about the fact that the Christian ethics, when we are saved by Christ, we are called to be the kind of people who are the exact citizens you would want to have. If everybody lived by the 10 Commandments, you wouldn't, in fact, need laws. But there is something radical about the claim that Christ is Lord. There is something about not putting all of your hope in human government and saying there is a separate king that can be subversive. I do think along Rebecca's answer to colonialism, when we see Christianity tied up in nationalist politics or in policies that oppress or marginalize or abuse or seek for power, that doesn't look like Jesus at all. That's a heretical use of what the gospel is. And so we should, if we've participated, repent, and we should exhort others to not take up power in a way that Christ specifically told his disciples not to. So at some level, I think Christianity is political because it's talking about a kingdom, but it's a very subversive type of political. It's a type of political where we're first called to so radically love that we would die for people and not ever to actually expose them to harm.
Staying with you, Rachel, someone asks, you sort of skimmed over the bit where you switched to believing in God. And this questioner wants to know, which passage in Mere Christianity gave you the epiphany? How did you come to truly change your belief?
I think
it sounded like magic when you told it.
Yeah, the funny thing for me about my experience reading that day in Mere Christianity is I don't remember what chapter I was in. I was probably somewhere in the middle because I know I've been reading it for a while. I don't think it was like a particular paragraph or a sentence. And you have to remember, I've been doing some background reading too. I've been doing a lot of internet stuff, particularly what had troubled me, like the friend Rebecca referenced, was the historical reliability of the resurrection. It was really sticking in my head. I actually had lunch with an atheist friend of mine probably about 6 months ago in Boston. He's like, just tell me how it happened. I'm like, man, I don't know how to explain it to you because I love rationality so much, but also I've been doing a bunch of reading and suddenly it just walloped me. It was a spiritual experience in many ways. Like I had all these reasons, but it wasn't this one particular reason that clicked it. It was an overwhelming sense that all of the data, all at once, was pointing to the obvious truth that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Jesus Christ existed, and that I had to respond to that.
Maybe to Rebecca then, is there one piece of evidence historically that really convinced you Jesus is God?
Well, so if we're thinking about historical evidence, the evidence would be the resurrection, the evidence for the resurrection. I don't know that that's primarily, so I guess I'm slightly flummoxed by the question because a historical piece of evidence that convinces me that Jesus is God, I can just answer a question if this historical evidence for the resurrection, or I can answer a question about what most convinces me that Jesus is God. But
why don't you do both in one?
Okay. Funnily enough, one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the resurrection to me is the fact that in all four gospel accounts, the primary witnesses of Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection are women. And that doesn't seem remarkable to us at all. But actually, in the ancient world, women would not have been seen as credible witnesses. Like if you were going to make a thing up, it would be undermining the credibility of the claim to say that it was first witnessed by women. And that, along with a whole bunch, I mean, if you read through the gospel accounts, actually, they're really embarrassing. I mean, Rachel said that all Jesus' friends were idiots. And she's like slightly having it up, but not really. Because the embarrassing portrayal of the early, like the people who went on to be the earliest Christian leaders, you know, for example, Jesus' one of his closest disciples, Simon Peter, whose utter denial of Jesus on the night that he was betrayed is like recorded across the Gospels. You know, if anybody had the power to like change the narrative, it was Peter. And it seems like he was happy for this story to be told. And likewise, you just wouldn't have made up that the women were the first witnesses of the resurrection. So it's sort of one of those, it seems like a little detail, but actually kind of has the ring of truth for me. Why do I find the idea that Jesus is God so compelling? Number one, as I read the gospel accounts, there is no other conclusion that I can draw. Like people think, oh, Jesus was just a good teacher. I think probably haven't read through the gospel accounts, at least not very carefully, because the claims he makes about himself are utterly outrageous and not ones of a mentally balanced good teacher. But for me, what it comes back to, honestly, is either Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, the resurrected Son of God, who loves me to the point of death and brings meaning to my entire life, or absolutely nothing means anything. And one of the interesting tensions I think many people who don't identify religiously and are sort of really thinking about these things find themselves in is that the things that they want to believe about human beings, for example, that we have like real worth and value, that we're even kind of individuals who make moral choices, that love is a real thing and not just a sort of chemical, biological thing going on between two people, any kind of love. They want to believe in universal human rights and real morality, like things actually being right and wrong. And on the other hand, they want to hold a view of the universe that it came from nowhere and is going nowhere. As I mentioned Richard Dawkins earlier, one of the things he says is the universe has precisely the properties we should expect. There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So for me always, I'm choosing between Jesus, the Son of God, and absolutely nothing. And my time and again in my life, I sort of see his fingerprints on things.
Thank you. We'll go back to a couple on human sexuality. Either of you can take it or both. You gave a religious reason for not accepting same-sex relationships. But how would any of this make sense to someone who isn't a Christian? Why would God hold gay atheists to a standard that doesn't make any sense to their reality?
I'm not sure that God does hold gay atheists. If a person doesn't believe in Christ and he isn't their king, his first posture towards them is not about whether or not they agree with God's sexual ethics or whether they agree with his economic propositions or anything like that. The biggest thing in their life is their rebellion against God, their unbelief. So I give a religious reason because I think the reason is religious, that God has actually ordered the world in such a way that theological meaning shoots through everything, and that the purpose of marriage and the purpose of singleness and the purpose of friendship and the purpose of family and so many other things are all beautiful, intricate pictures of the gospel. I don't expect that to actually be appealing to someone who rejects Christ, but I do think it's not unreasonable, if that makes sense. If you reject God out of hand, and you might not say that that's very compelling. I think that's fine. But if you have to actually encounter Christ and encounter his claims, understand who he is, then I do think what the scriptures represent as his words about the body do make a lot of sense and hold a consistency and a coherence.
So just following up on behalf of that question. So it isn't even in God's top 10 with gay atheists who are living together and having sex. Is it not a moral issue for them until they believe the Christian story, and then it becomes sinful?
Everything about our life is a moral issue. So I think our culture has zeroed in on sexuality and certain sexual questions for a whole host of reasons. We could spend a lot of time. Read Charles Taylor, huge books about why we've done this, right? But in God's eyes, every thought we think, every word we say, every feeling we feel is dripping with morality. So everything we do actually has deep significance. But the major question is, as Jesus posed famously to his friend, that I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who lives in me, everyone who believes in me will live and never die. Do you believe this? I mean, that's the question that faces all of us.
Can I add a little Harry Potter moment?
Of course.
Just because 5-minute
Harry Potter.
So I think part of the premise of this question, I think, is that we should really be judged by our own moral standards. And that's it's not an unreasonable thing to think. I don't think it's a biblical way of thinking. But I find it fascinating and troubling how in the Harry Potter series, Vernon and Petunia, so Harry's uncle and aunt who raise him, or think they raise him, they think that they are really good people. They actually think they've been extremely kind to Harry, to have him in their house and to put a roof over his head and feed him meal. From their perspective, they are very upright, moral people. Now, from the reader's perspective, they're actually not at all. We have a totally different sort of moral vantage point when it comes to them. But within their own ethical world, actually what they're doing is above and beyond. And it's just sort of that troubling, like one of the things that I experience as I read the Gospels is I keep sort of stumbling upon the ways in which actually Jesus' moral standards and his view of me are very different from my own view of myself. And ultimately, he is the one who made me in the first place and died for me and offered me salvation. He's the one who actually has the right to judge me rather than me judging by my own moral standards.
What do I do if I'm a Christian struggling with gender dysphoria?
I hope beyond hope that you have a community of people who love Jesus and love you, who can walk with you in grace and in truth. Every single Christian is going to experience some form of brokenness because of the world. Sin isn't, when humanity chose to sin, it's not just something that was, a legal thing. It also created fractures in creation. As Christians, none of us should be surprised that there's all kinds of brokennesses in the world and in our own bodies. And one of the ways that creation can be disrupted is when we don't feel like we have a home in our own body. Christianity uniquely offers a belief that there is, in the new heavens and the new earth, a resurrection of the body, that Christ is a first fruit, and that each of us will receive a new and powerful and spiritual body. So one thing I would say to a disciple who experiences gender dysphoria is to sink your roots deep into Christ, into that promise that someday you will receive a new body that actually feels like home for the first time. But I would also counsel you to walk closely with Christian friends and explore together what does it mean to make peace with the body that God has given you now. And that doesn't mean it will be an easy thing, and it doesn't mean it will be a quick thing, but it's a worthwhile pursuit. I've got friends who are in this exact position, and for many of them it's been an agonizing experience on the one hand, but also for many of them, they speak about it in honesty as the thing that has drawn them closest to the love of Christ. And so I don't want to underplay either the difficulty, but also the ability of God's grace to work through that experience to communicate who he is to you powerfully.
Thank you. Why Jesus? What about the other world religions? What makes Christianity any more true?
So the end of that question is interesting, more true. I think there are many, actually very well-meaning people today who would say, do you know what, can't we just agree that all religions are equal kind of paths to God? And so rather than saying, this one is true and those ones are false, which seems like a kind of arrogant or judgmental or not even very sophisticated sort of way of thinking, that instead we should just say, okay, all religions are maybe giving us different angles on God's truth, but all kind of fit together, right? The problem is that Jesus doesn't fit. And one of the ways in which he doesn't fit is because of the wild claims he makes about himself, which even, Christianity flows out of Judaism, and one of the distinctives of Judaism in the ancient world was that Jews were monotheists. They believed there was one creator God of all the heavens and all the earth, and almost everybody around them believed in multiple gods. It was very much a minority report at the time. There was only one creator God. Today, it's like most people, at least in the West, think the question is God or not God, rather than, there could be multiple gods. So we have Judaism, which is fiercely monotheistic, and then this disruptive claim being made that actually the one creator God of all the universe, who was so holy and transcendent that humans couldn't look on God and live, had in fact become flesh, become a human being in the person of Jesus Christ. So that's one of the places where Christianity and Judaism sort of have an interesting conversation. But then we get to Jesus' resurrection, and that's a historical claim. something that either happened or didn't happen. And you could say, well, we can't prove today whether it did happen or not. Fine. But it either did or it didn't. Because the claim is that Jesus bodily rose from the dead, not that it was just like some sort of metaphorical resurrection. Now Christians believe that Jesus died on the cross and was raised to life on the third day. Muslims actually believe that Jesus didn't die but seemed to die. And Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, agnostics, most other people in the world think that Jesus died and didn't rise again. Now those are different claims on history. I'm not saying we can take a video camera back 2,000 years and watch the empty, watch Jesus' tomb and see what happened. But if we could, we're either right or wrong about that. And so there's actually no way in which Christianity could be like sort of true, or that Christianity and Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism could all be equally true. At the end of the day, you have to choose. So then what criteria might you choose on? And I can imagine people taking a whole range of views of that. You could say, okay, blunt instrument, but what is the belief system that seems to actually make the most sense across the world and across cultures? Well, it's Christianity. What is the belief system that laid the foundations for modern science? Well, it's Christianity. What is the belief system that gives us our deepest ethical beliefs? For example, our belief that all human beings are fundamentally morally equal, that men and women are equal, that the strong and the rich and powerful shouldn't trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalized, that love across racial difference is good. Like all the things going back to that politics question, that whether we're Christians, atheists, agnostics, or whatever, we all share certain common beliefs. And if you look at the history of ideas, those are not self-evident truths, they're Christian beliefs. So you say, well, maybe the one that sort of formed my deepest moral beliefs, that's Christianity as well. So there are lots of different angles that you could take, and that's enough. I'm not going to say more.
Okay, just a small one to end then, and you can both have a crack at this. What does the Bible present as the overarching purpose for life?
I wish I was Presbyterian, because then I would know that first answer in the Westminster Confession. I was like, I think it is, but I'm not going to get it quite right, and this is the exact context to not get it right. But I do think that the purpose, that the big story we get in the Bible is that God created a humanity because he was overflowing with love. And even though we're all desperately trying to run away, he just keeps running after us. And he is going to restore this family and restore everything in the new heavens and the new earth. And he's calling and desperately calling for each of us and all of us together to participate in it, to be his children, to be brothers and sisters to each other, and to experience the joy and the purpose that we are in fact longing for.
Jesus was asked to summarize the Old Testament law. He said two things: love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul, your mind and your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And one of the ways in which, as a Christian, anybody in this room who's a Christian is called to love their neighbor, not the only way, but one of the ways, is to actually tell them the message of Jesus. So what is the purpose of my life? It is to worship God with my heart and my soul and my mind and my strength, to love him. And that will play itself out in trying as best I can to practically and spiritually love those around me. And sometimes that means saying something to somebody that's literally the last thing they want to hear, because actually it is more important for them to know the truth and to have the opportunity to repent and believe and be saved than for me to just spare their feelings now and leave them to face God's judgment without Jesus' sacrifice in their place.
But can I press you to recast that answer for someone who's not a believer? Because I assume you're not saying to those who aren't believers here, the purpose of your life is to tell people about Jesus. I mean, maybe in a roundabout way you will want to say that, but for the person who's not a Christian believer here, what does the Bible say is their reason for existence?
Well, I think the most important thing you can do with your life if you're not a Christian is to figure out what you think about Jesus. I have a close friend at the moment who was raised Jewish in California, went to Israel to sort of try and understand more about Judaism, and actually became kind of somewhat disillusioned, and is now in a place where she doesn't anymore believe in Judaism. She doesn't yet, and I say yet because I do think the Lord is after her, she doesn't yet believe in Jesus. And she's in a period at the moment where she left one job, she's been looking for another, and she's very clever. She graduated Stanford, she's very highly qualified. For the last 6 months, she hasn't had a job. And that's been hard for her. I said to her the other day, I was like, I actually think this is a great gift to you, because rather than figuring out like what career are you partaking in, like how can you progress up the ladder in business or whatever it is, instead you have a lot of time right now to figure out something far more important than that, which is who is Jesus and how are you going to respond to him.
Will you thank Rachel and Rebecca?